You know, I often come to these presentations with something already.
Has a distinct advantage in being able to identify suspicious activity. With the right training and tools, this sector can be equipped to identify new money laundering trends that may be linked to slavery, and in doing so, can also help offset the risk to their own organization from illegal and fraudulent businesses.
You know, they told me that was coming on, and I walked up here anyways and said what I was going to say anyways. You know, it's interesting. Sometimes when you're doing talks like this, you think you know what you're going to say, but I think based on the theme of what Lisa and Ambassador Sidibaka have been focusing on, this idea of reaching into the crowd and saying, listen, we all have a place in helping to address this issue, is an important part of what this theme of this particular event will be. So I'm simply going to kind of change my remarks a little bit based on that. Okay, so I work with the private sector, and what I've come to realize with the private sector is that sometimes they want to see the numbers that help them to understand what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. So I'm going to start with some of the math you've already heard today. To begin with, let's look at the number that has been used 3 or 4 times already. There were 45.8 million people in slavery. If you assume that there's about a 20% turnover a year, that means that there's approximately 25,200 people entering slavery per day. That's about the size of my hometown in Newington, Connecticut. If you break that down into kind of a per second basis, every 4 seconds we have another person entering slavery. We'll do it. 1, 2, 3, 4, another slave. And the drum beats on and on and on. And as Kimberly indicated, there were more slaves than any other time in history. And that really shocks and surprises people, because most people are shocked to surprise that there's even slavery. And all of a sudden they hear that there's more slaves today than any other time in history. You saw lots of examples through Lisa's presentation. And so you saw real people. And that's an extremely important part of that process, is seeing those people. Profits generated from human slavery, $150 billion a year. To put the billion number into perspective, if you were to start counting from the moment you were born, it would take, and every second represented a number, it would take you 34 years to get to 1 billion. We're talking about a huge number here. Tremendous amount of money being generated. The amount of money that is generated in a minute is about 285,000. So that puts into perspective that particular element. And lastly, every one of these 45.8 million people are real people who are out there in terrible, horrible circumstances. You now juxtapose the fact that there's about $350 million used a year to address the issue. There's about 15,000 do-gooder types like me around the world who focus on this. And then you have a couple of thousand agencies, NGOs, organizations that focus on this, and you have basically the response. Now, all of that is leading us in the direction of one thing. The number of people that are helped globally, about 65,000, 66,000 people, or 0.2%. 7,000 convictions out of about 500,000, 0.8. We're losing the fight against modern slavery. That's why the private sector needs to be involved. So why should banks care about this? Well, first of all, there's a lot of legislation that's being put out there that makes organizations, including banks, be concerned about this. California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, UK's Modern Slavery Act, acts out of France and Australia that are coming up. Legislation says private sector needs to be involved. In addition to this, you have a tremendous amount of media coverage that has been growing systematically over time. For the last 4 years, the coverage of this particular issue has doubled almost every year. As a result of that, we're now seeing many articles, exposés, documentaries that focus on this. And lastly, there's just a lot of people that are saying, well, we think the private sector needs to get involved. There's a certain number of lawsuits that we're seeing out there. There's the legislation that says that you have to do certain things. As a result of all of these things, the banks need to be concerned. But the ultimate reason why they need to be concerned is that $150 billion generated from criminal activities is money laundering. And if any of that money makes its way into a legitimate bank, the banks get penalized. So there's a business risk element to this. Okay, so what are the banks doing to address this issue? Well, actually, I'm quite happy to say here in Hong Kong, the banks are quite active. They're doing a lot of different things, and I'm just going to walk you through some of these. The first one is that we're seeing typologies being developed. What's a typology? Well, basically what you do is you take a crime, you break it into its component parts, and then you visualize it in a way that you can see the relationships between criminal activities, the money flow, and so forth. Or Liberty Asia's working on that, Mekong Club's working on that. It's a great tool because it allows you to identify and piece together where you think the problem might be in a supply chain. Second is forensic accounting. Now, forensic accounting is exactly what you say. You look at the numbers in order to identify whether or not there's an issue. The classic case that is often used to describe this is in the United States, there was a nail salon franchise, and that particular franchise had hours that ran from 9 until 9 at night. And so a couple of accountants looked at the data and saw that there were transactions taking place at 2 or 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, around $200, $300 every time. When they looked into this, they came to realize that there was a sex trafficking case being run out of that franchise. So numbers can help us to identify what it is that we need to know as to whether or not there's suspicious behavior. Now, I've worked in the NGO world, in the US government, I've worked in the donor world for a long time. When I first started to approach the private sector and to talk to them as an NGO person, they didn't want to have any conversation with me. Why? Because I came from a world that often named and shamed and embarrassed them. But we're seeing that there's a change, that organizations are stepping up in the NGO world and working with the banks. And why is that important? Because the banks need the information that we have. And to a certain extent, the NGOs need the information that the banks have. That's a really good kind of transition that we're moving toward. We're also seeing more emphasis on law enforcement and banks talking. At the end of the day, law enforcement know about criminal activity. And if they were able to share more of that information with the banking world, wouldn't we be better off? Now, there are some restrictions. There's some reasons why that can't happen, laws that prevent information going back and forth. Hopefully that will change over time. But at the end of the day, this is an essential part of what we need to be focusing on. Red flags. What we're finding is that there are certain indicators of suspicious behavior that if you find them, you can say, well, maybe we have a problem here and maybe we should look at this. And so in the United States, there was the North American Bankers Alliance. Then in Europe, there was the European Bankers Alliance. And now we have the kind of Asian Banker Alliance. And what we're finding is that if we can identify these individual suspicious things, bring them together, we can then have a situation that allows us to find criminal behavior that's going to help us to address things. So what can we do with these? Well, if you have big data, I heard that something about $27 trillion moves through the banks every day. If you could identify these red flags and then identify how, if you get a pattern of them, then you can have a suspicious report go off to a compliance officer, then all of a sudden you have a system in place that would allow for us to really be able to determine whether this criminal activity is taking place. And so we're seeing more emphasis on that. We have WorldCheck and World Compliance. These are huge databases that have publicly available information about criminal behavior. Literally millions of names in these databases. And up until recently, it didn't include human trafficking. But again, because of the work of Liberty Asia and others, they were able to go and work with the NGOs, collect media information. They give it off to Reuters and to LexisNexis. And as a result of that, they were able to then insert this into these databases so that they could do the analysis to determine whether or not new people coming into the banking system or ongoing ones have issues. And then we have basically training. The organization I run, the Mekong Club, does a lot of training for banks. We do it for senior level, director level, communications, compliance officers. A lot of people simply don't know about this issue. All of a sudden, somebody comes and lays on their desk, you now have to, in addition to all the other things that you're doing, address this particular issue. And they have a lot of questions. So basically, what we need is for them to be brought up to speed through training. And lastly, multi-stakeholder groups. Basically allowing a place for the bankers to come together, to work as a group, in order for them to be able to say, listen, we don't understand this, or we're doing this, and then share that information. Why is that important? Because every bank approaches this a little bit differently. And being able to share that information among the group is an essential part of the process. All right, one other slide, I'm going to skip it, but I'm just going to go back to that theme that we saw through some of the other presentations. We all have something to offer. Whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a banker, whether you're a communications person, whether you're a housewife, whether you're a student, whether you're a faith-based individual, we all have certain skills. If we could find a way of tapping into those individual skills that we have and applying them, just imagine where we would be. If 10 million people did 10 million small compassionate efforts using their skills, we would be so much further along than where we are now. We've seen that the 15,000 people like us aren't able to get beyond 0.2%. 0.2%. You heard the stories. You heard the things that these people go through. What we're dealing with here, we have a responsibility to take on because we're dealing with something so big, so horrific, and so relevant, slavery, that we should all take a part in this. So as you listen to the panels, as you listen to what people have to say, I urge you as a challenge to think about, what could I do? What skills do I have to bring to the table? And then to take it to the next step after this, to then go and say, okay, well, where do I go from here? How do I make a call to somebody so that I can offer a little bit of my time, effort, money, whatever it is that you want to do? That would certainly make a difference. With that, thank you very much.